Welcome, friends. Pour your favorite cup of tea, coffee, or cocoa and settle in for Sips from the Utica Institute Museum. Sips from the Sip is all about sharing the history of little-known people and places in Mississippi. We're serving up truth, justice, with a dollop of sass. I'm your host, Jean Greene. Today's episode is the 34th of a multi-part series of readings and discussions from the book Black Man's Burden. Joining me today to discuss Chapter 17 is DJ Hudson. So welcome everyone back to the podcast today. I have the honor of having with me DJ Hudson. DJ Hudson is a Black, trans, generational Southerner, community organizer. He's a people's librarian, a public theologian, a Renaissance person, and itinerant movement preacher and Black cowboy. So DJ has consented to discuss Chapter 17 of Black Man's Burden with me today. And in this chapter, if I could be allowed to just do a quick synopsis, Holtzclaw talks to his audience about students who have come to him and gone through the Institute and how they have positively impacted their communities. He talks about a particular Negro preacher who he met, who had created community and built a school and a store that helped the people, the Black people who were in that area, sustain their autonomy. These people had multi-room homes, had owned land, and were very instrumental in keeping that area going. He talks about students who had come to him, their father had brought them, and they went on after they graduated to create a school and a community in the nearby town of Learning. He also mentions Theodcious Skelton, who was the first boarding student for the Institute, and how she went on to teach. Well, he tells about her background and how she went from that. She transcended that and went on to teach in Florida, as well as come back to teach at the Institute. And then finally, he gives credit to Mary Ella, his wife, for being the supporter of him and his helpmeet and partner in the building and running of the Institute. And that was something that I felt really good to see, that this woman, these women, because the other students were women, were uplifted by this man in a time when women weren't being uplifted, in a place where they were expected to be subservient and not produce or contribute as much as they did. But I wanted to allow DJ the time to pull from all his myriad background and talk about the women's movement, as we say, or compare, if you would, how Holtzclaw and the Institute stands in with the overarching HBCU situation. So DJ.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for wrangling with that mouthful of a bio. I'm so excited to be here, and here we are. I'm excited and ready to get going. And I have so many different thoughts. So I'm trying to settle and gather myself. But the first I can say is where I want to start is, in my dear alma mater, Fisk University, is where I attended. I matriculated through Fisk in 2006 and graduated from 2006 to 2010. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that struck me, I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia, specifically Clayton County. If anybody's familiar with College Park, which is where the airport is, the Atlanta airport. And if you know anybody who's around my age, I'm 36, so a millennial, anyone born in the late 80s, early 90s, or who lived in and around Atlanta around that time, then you probably know about how much the city of Atlanta, and especially its demographics, were changed by the coming of the Olympics. And so my story is one that definitely is a time travel-y one, but it's one that has always been shaped, one by like very, very Black places. I've always been from the South, and my whole family is from And again, like Fisk being the place that raised me intellectually in a lot of ways. But I also have been shaped in ways that I'm always coming to understand better by these like different divergent forces and different kind of competing value systems of what does it mean for Black people to be free? What does it mean for Black people to flourish and to thrive? What does it mean for there to be justice and equity for Black people? I'm literally a child who is a product of the Black Mecca and have had the privilege to be able to be poured into by many, many Black elders. And so one of the things that struck me when I first got to Fisk was, at least when I was a student, one of the first things they do is they take you to the statue of W.B. Du Bois that stands on our campus because Fisk is the place where W.B. Du Bois also went to undergraduate.
Mm-hmm.
And they stand you in front of the statue, and you're full up of all of this powerful, beautiful history that I want to be clear, I have tremendous respect for, and I hold in all of its complexity. And as somebody who comes from a long line of working class Black folks, all of my grandparents have been janitors, house cleaners, maids, working people is who my people are and where I come from. It struck me then and has not left me since that the folks who are welcoming us onto campus said that you students, as the new class of Fisk University, are the talented 10th, just like Du Bois left us in this legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And as a talented 10th, it is also your responsibility to pull up the other 90. And when they say pull up the other 90, they point behind Du Bois' statue across the street over the end of the campus. And what they're gesturing towards is the Andrew Jackson housing projects, which, like a
Okay.
lot of historically Black colleges and universities, lives just right across the street.
Right.
And the name is, I want to say again, is the Andrew Jackson Housing Projects, right? So there's a lot of complexity and contradiction to be found in the different ways that we as Black folks talk about what it means, what is Black excellence, what is Black liberation, what is Black freedom. And I've been aware of those one way or another. And that really has guided a lot of my organizing, my scholarship, my history and curiosity. So all of that said, one of the things that stood out to me the most in reading Holtzclaw and actually got held up, we were talking about it a little bit before we started recording, but I actually got caught a couple of pages before chapter 17 where he is, I believe, quoting from I think this is a letter or it is a document from the Farmers
Mm-hmm.
and I'm trying to find the page number here because I'm looking at it digitally. But want to read real quick. Yeah, like pages 132, 33 in there is where they are.
Mm-hmm.
When he says things like nowhere in the, well, he's not saying this, he's quoting it, but he's quoting
Right.
it for a reason because he's trying to amplify this, right? As what
Right.
is he believes is necessary for Black folks to understand and to act on. He says, nowhere in the world is there such an opportunity for us as is offered on the plantations of the South. Where we permitted, we would urge the Southern planters to furnish their laborers better houses, giving them humane treatment, general encouragement, and protection against outrages. And by outrages, they mean lynching and race riots. Let's be clear.
Exactly.
We urge with all our souls that no Negro allow the acquisition of a little learning or of wealth to make him pompous so as to delight his enemies and disgust his friends. We should remain sober with a deep sense of imperfection, diligent in every pursuit with simplicity and manners. Okay, so one, as also a person who is a minister and a theologian, because after I left this, I attended Vanderbilt Divinity School because I had a whole lot of questions for God and the
Mm-hmm.
tradition. Still do, and I'm working through them, but we have a great time answering them. There's a lot of religious language like laced in here into this document.
Yes.
And this is a
Yes.
document from a farmers conference. And that's because I recognize Holtzclaw, at least this book, being a part of what Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham would call the politics of respectability, which is
Okay.
actually a Black political and religious, cultural, social movement. But I want to be really clear that it is political and religious, as well as social and cultural movement.
Okay.
That was happening from 1880 to 1920. And her book, Righteous Discontent, is about the women's movement in the Black Baptist Church during this time,
Mm-hmm.
1880 and 1920. Because what was happening is just like you said, and also as I have seen and known my whole entire life, is that Black women always have the keys. Black
Mm-hmm.
women were the ones who were leading from within their churches, but also they were leading and they were demanding political and economic change because they were facing rape. They were facing, obviously these race riots and lynching. They were also facing joblessness, homelessness, houselessness. And they knew that part of it was because in the Reconstruction era, the way that white supremacy was trying to find a way to deal with Black people, the problem of Black people, right? It's not an accident that Holtzclaw named his book even The Black Man's Burden, right? As a reference to the white man's burden. Is that what was happening is that there were a large body of Black people, maybe a generation or two after Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who were saying perhaps the way for us to keep the boot of white supremacy off of our neck, to allow the Black nation to breathe long enough for us to find our footing in this nation. Listen, Du Bois, we hear you about dignity, we hear you about intellectual, all that. That's great. If we don't survive, if we don't have land, if we don't have jobs, if our children cannot move us forward, then none of that matters. That's beautiful, buddy. We love you, Webby. And also, we got to eat. And we know these white people will look for any reason to kill us, including believing ridiculous things like that we are dirty or that we are immoral, that we are lazy, and that we deserve sexual assault and violence. And so this movement was really Black women leading by saying, if we can present ourselves as a wholesale, as a people, as exemplary, right? As above reproach, that we have studied, shown ourselves approved, are ready for work, and our hands are clean, then what in the world can they say no to us about? Why would they throw us in jail? Why would they hurt us? Now, the question you asked me when you first invited me to talk about this, much to my joy and elation, was, is Holtzclaw relevant today? And I can't say but a resoundingly 1,000,000%, because what I hear Holtzclaw saying now really resonates a lot with what you're hearing Black folks say nowadays when they ask questions, when we're looking at problems like gun violence, right? And youth, talking about Atlanta. And I'm getting very real as a person who, this is my home, this is my city, these are my cousins, these are my, my neighbors that we're talking about, right?
Right.
When people talk about and they say things like, well, what about the parents, and where are the parents? And these kids these days are just, they don't care about anything or anybody. They're just so violent, and they're just on their phones all the time and playing these video games, right? That is what we see as like a descendant of this same attempt, right, to find dignity and survival for Black people, and being what we see in this letter, right, and remaining sober with a deep sense of imperfection, diligent in every pursuit. If we just work hard enough, I'm in Atlanta, the Black Mecca, the absolute kingdom of Black entrepreneurship and culture. Let me tell you, Tyler Perry's studio is a peach throw away from where I'm sitting right now. And so there's still a very, very strong belief that if Black people, if we can just make enough money, if we can represent ourselves enough, if we can get kids to behave enough. Let's think about all the parents who were videotaped catching their kids at protests in 2020 and how people would turn back. Instead of being able to be where I and my generation and people are at, which is saying a Black person should not have to do a single thing other than draw breath, to be allowed to continue to draw that breath with dignity. It doesn't matter what they're cussing. It doesn't matter if they got a bonnet on. It doesn't matter who they just hit. It doesn't matter how many degrees they have. If they are Black, they are as responsible for their actions as anyone else, but they are also as worthy as dignity and humanity. And
that's correct.
Lots of people, just like with Du Bois, would say that that is naive. So all that to say, I'm so excited. You're going to have a devil of a time editing this with me, because I got lots of notes and thoughts and ideas. But yeah, I'm really grateful to be here with you today. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm just really glad that you mentioned a couple of things there. One was the respectability politics that we had talked about earlier before we started recording. And I really see how that is woven through Holtzclaw's book. We need to be upright and without spot or blemish. We need to be clean. We need to show the white people that we are, as good. And then a couple of chapters earlier, when you were mentioning that women need to be able to feel safe in their workplace, he mentioned that he had some young women that had gone to work and had not felt safe in their workplace. They were not, quote unquote, protected. And that was a euphemism for what I knew had to have been sexual assault. So he was writing carefully
Right.
so that the Black folks would know what he was talking about, but the white folks wouldn't be offended by what he was talking about. And that was a delicate balance. But I really liked what you mentioned earlier, bringing all of those different elements together, the women in the church, the talented 10th
Mm-hmm.
argument that Du Bois had, and that was his point of digression with Booker T. Washington. And I wanted to talk too about how part of what Holtzclaw did emulated not only what they did at Tuskegee, but also what Fisk did, and how he worked all of that together to create this gumbo that works to this day. But when you talk about relevance of Holtzclaw, his political acumen, I didn't really give him a lot of credit for that until I read the book. And I'd like you to speak on how his political relevance is something that we could emulate.
Absolutely. I think one of the first things that Holtzclaw does that I really am eager to see many more Black folks, especially in my generation, doing, and that I myself need to do more of, which is to articulate the questions and what we believe are our answers, whatever conclusions we might have. But what are the questions to be asked about what's most important to Black people at this time? One of the things that I think a lot about, right, is the role of social media and the
Mm-hmm.
ways that we talk about social media and the ways that we talk to each other about it. I hear people asking a lot of questions all the time, and a lot of those questions end up getting pointed at us as a community, at Black people, of like, why do we spend so much time here? And we just put all our business here and all this. And
Mm-hmm.
what I want to see more of is folks asking questions about how do we get here? And if it's not just us wanting to be addicted to a device or a series of apps, what else is happening? And then we start to see the ways that social media are platforms that are run by companies that are now the places where a lot of Black folks understand the most important parts of Black political discourse to be happening. And I think it's really clear now the role that these corporations are playing now that you have people who are literally having to do the work, like this Black woman who is out doing the work of archiving Black Twitter, which is an
Mm.
unimaginable task, but also an absolutely necessary one that nobody probably thought was going to be as urgent as it was 10 years ago when Twitter was still new versus 10 months ago when, Elon Musk first took it, right? And so
Right.
like there's really crucial questions for us as a people and as a community to ask. And I also think it's really important for us to be able to listen to one another, and not listen meaning accepting every single thing that's said and heard, but to actually have a real discourse. One of the most important things that I learned both from Black women activists and organizers who trained and who sold in so much to me in Nashville, Tennessee, my organizing there, but also my professors like Professor Wynn at Tennessee State University and Fisk University, shout out to her, and dear Dr. Revis Mitchell, who is an ancestor now, who was the chair of the history department at the time. But one of the things that they stressed to me and so many of my peers was that Black people are not monolithic, and
Mm.
that in order to really truly be a critical thinker, you have to be able to ride the waves of a political discourse by recognizing that because we are Black and we are profound and we are beautiful, there's no reason to expect that we would agree. And one of my favorite, I've been rereading one of my absolute favorite books ever, which is Zora Neale Hurston's autobiography, Dust Tracks on the Road. And the copy that I found most recently is one that has in the appendix a copy of her essay chapter, My People, My People. I love her for so many reasons, but one of the things she talks about is how one of the ways you can recognize my people, and she's talking about Black people, but for Zora, that's Black people with the asterisk, a specific subset of Black people. But it's one of the ways you can recognize us is that we never agree on anything. And she's joking, and she's being humorous, but you mentioned something early on too about like the ways that Holtzclaw, is clearly like doing a sort of dog whistling, right? Where he is signaling this very, very actually revolutionary and radical and prophetic message, but he's doing it in such a way that he will not be easily readily recognized as such to the white gaze, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
something that I think we are several generations from understanding as a skill, as something
Mm.
that I think that people who are doing liberation work in the global South do recognize and understand. But like one of the places of political discourse I found myself in, I was trained a lot by people who were survivors of and who were participants in the civil rights movement, especially in Nashville and in the South and in Tennessee. I spent a lot of time at the Highlander Center. I will puppy dog follow behind any movement elder who will allow me long enough. And one of the things that I learned from them is that there were a lot more things that people disagreed about during the movement than folks realize and are willing to accept. That I think that civil rights historians know a lot more about the political disagreements about nonviolence, right? But what I hear on the streets and from everyday people a lot is people boiling it down to Malcolm versus Martin, which is sadly really reductionist only because what it does is it turns nonviolence into what white people wish it was. Is the best way I can describe it. It turns nonviolent resistance into, we love you white people so much that we are willing to pray for you and let you beat the shit out of us in public until you realize that maybe that's a bad idea. That's what Holtzclaw sounds like to us in like 2024 on the surface, right?
Yeah.
But what people who have been doing liberation work across the South, the global South, and by the global South, I mean South America, Central America. I mean, where you will in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Central Africa, where you can die for saying the things that we don't think twice about, quote, like tweeting, things that we can put on a t-shirt and just walk out the house with, you can end up here for saying. And so like, there are folks in the world and in history, and there are Black people still in our communities today, especially in our families in the Deep South, if we were to ask them, who, talking about Mississippi, oh my goodness, who would tell me right quick and in a hurry that back in the day in Mississippi and now today, white folks knew whose land they would step on and leave with a little bit heavier full of lead in their behind, like people knew who shot back. And so this was never a kumbaya experience. Mississippi summer was one of the most deadly experiences, like the students on their wills before they went on the freedom rise. These are things I learned from hearing it directly from folks, right? And so there's a different way that we talk to each other and that we talk in public when you can be lynched just for speaking your mind. And so it's not that I'm saying that we're taking something for granted with the role of social media. I just want us to be more curious about what is shaping how we talk about being Black today. Where are we having these conversations? Who's in that conversation? Who's missing from the conversation?
Right.
People, like I had a long conversation with my neighbor who I just met earlier today. And I took the chance to ask her, this poor Black lady who's just trying to get to work on her way, what do you think it's gonna take to unify Black people right now today? Because that's a question that Zora Neale Hurston is recording somebody asking in the 1920s. And so of course I should ask a Black lady who is my neighbor, who remembers the time when the houses on either side of me were populated with other Black people instead of being populated by corporations. One house on one side of me is an Airbnb. The other one, the one that she was asking me about, is empty because my neighbors who lived there, who were elderly and disabled, who were a family, got the house bought out from up under them, allegedly bought. We don't know for how much, right? But by some developers, a Black one who was the one who came over and shook my hand and told me I should be excited because we're going to be neighbors because they're going to clean up my neighborhood. I live in the West End in Atlanta, and tore down a church that my new neighbor, Miss Tammy, told me that church was 100 years old.
They tore that down?
Tore the church down and bought the house across the street, pushed my elderly and disabled neighbors out so that house can serve as an office. Now, this happened about a year and a half ago. That house is still sitting vacant. Atlanta has one of the highest, most skyrocketing, most brutal houselessness rates in the country. It's going up everywhere. But one of the things that is a place of deep heartbreak for me and so many Black Atlantans and people who are native to Georgia is how many people you can visibly see living on the streets in Atlanta, the Black Mecca. And the vast majority of them are Black, right? This tells you a lot about the time period that we're in. This is also one of the first times where the white population of Atlanta and Fulton County is actually rising while the Black population is lowering. Yes. This is the context and the background of what you hear about Cop City and people protesting it, right? This is why law is relevant today. This is why no matter what generation you are, if you are listening to this, being able to read and understand that as a people, as a Black people, in order for us to get free, there's never going to be one singular person. Because when I asked Miss Tammy, what do you think is the answer to unify some Black people? She got really sad in the ways that a lot of Black folks will say. And the first thing she did, she looked off in the distance and she said, King is dead. He's dead. They're gone. They're all gone. I don't know.
Who is going to be the centralizing leader?
For her.
That's what she's saying. Yeah.
Yeah, for her. And for her, the only one is Jesus. And again, this is where we come back to the power of the Black church, which again, unfortunately, I believe has also lost its way in a lot of ways, because the Black church now, you're just as liable to go to church and you are going for a worship experience. One of my professors, Dr. Stacy Floyd Thomas at Vanderbilt Divinity School, a womanist ethicist, used to point out the difference and the distinction of a worship center versus a church. When Black people went to the Black church, you went to the church. Your church served as a bank. Your church was a place where you could find jobs. Your church was a place where life services were done, where you could be married, where you could be christened, baptized, and buried, right? Like, you went to a church for pastoral care. You went to a church when someone in your family was experiencing violence or abuse or incarceration.
Right.
In a worship center, you go to worship. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay.
But I think that it is really important for us to be literate in the variety of the ways that we as Black people have tried to get free, so that we can recognize there's never going to be one answer. And we need the tension that comes out of a diversity, not just following the biggest, brightest, shiny thing, because nowadays, unfortunately, that's liable to be a lot more about capitalism than it is to be about liberation, even if it says about Blackness.
I got you. I'm really interested in where you were going with that. And I was thinking about Holtzclaw. I'm always thinking about Holtzclaw. And you mentioned about the social media. And for the time, his media, since he was a printer, his media was his Southern Notes and the letters and articles he wrote. That was how he moved the word around about what he was doing and what his ideas were. So there's always been a method to share, but it has never been as immediate as it is now, where you think it, you type it, and it is out there in the world. That has never been as crucial as it is now. But his thoughtfulness and the way he carefully worded and constructed his book and his thoughts within that book, especially within this chapter as in the other chapters. I really like that you're making that analogy and that connection with the church. Even though Holtzclaw did not subscribe to any one denomination, he was very careful in not doing that. He was brought before the Black church folks, and they demanded that he tell them what he was, and he did.
Ooh, I would not have wanted to be in his shoes.
I
don't know how he got away with that. That story. Yeah, you told me this when we spoke on the phone, and it's one I can't wait to do even more research, because that is a very, very fascinating and really powerful time for Black folks in the Black church. And for so many different reasons, I also, academically, but also just personally have experienced the Black church as being much more than a religious institution.
Oh, yes. Yes. It was during his time, he mentions several different denominations. But when they hemmed him up, and I'm saying hemmed him up because that's what they did, they got him in a meeting and they said, "What are you? Who are you? What are you?" And he would not say. And so one of the sisters of the church said, "Brothers, he ain't nothing." And he didn't deny that, because that suited his purpose. A lot of Black schools were founded by white mission groups and white churches. And this one place did not have any of those affiliations. So he could operate with a sense of freedom, where he might not have been able to if he was with a specific organization or denomination. The last thing I want to go over before we end today, I don't want to stop our dialogue at all, DJ, because I enjoy what we're talking about, and it's given me added insight into who Holtzclaw was as a person in 1915. And you mentioned that sometimes we allow our, and I'm guilty of this, allow our 2024 sensibilities to color how we look at someone who was operating in 1915. So I appreciate that insight. I do want to add one last thing to our discussion. Can we talk about how education was what he was pushing and what Du Bois was pushing in a way to help uplift folks?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness, yes. And thank you also for pointing out and bringing me back to, him getting hemmed up in the church, because I see that as a political play that was just so masterful and strategic and visionary, but it was for the sake of education, right? And that was what was really driven into me by what I learned and also what I experienced by being at Fisk, is how, particularly with the founding of these schools, education was absolutely a political act. There was a reason why, like, there's all these, like, schools always have their mythologies and their urban legends. And at Fisk, one of them, and please, don't go on this campus and let these Fisk students tell you this is true. I am here telling you that Dr. Revis Mitchell himself told me to tell y'all that it is not true that the stone walls that encircle the Jubilee Hall of Fisk University were put in place to protect the school from the Klan. It is not true that the bells that are there in front of New Livingston Hall and elsewhere on the campus were meant to ring alarms, or on the bell tower were not there to warn people for the Klan. Those are victory bells for football. Those are from when we had a football team.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't somebody with a rifle posted up in the tower. However, the fact that these stories carry forward with us anyway, right, says a lot about our memories and what we know and what we do know, what we remember. And it also says that one thing that Black folks know from time immemorial, whether we set foot on a HBCU ever, or whether we've been the dean of one forever, is that when a Black person moves towards education in this nation, something shifts to oppose them, and often with violence, right? And nowadays, what we see is the economic violence of debt. Howdy, shout out to you, other Black millennials who were taught by, our parents' generation, that going to college, and especially going to a HBCU, was one of the greatest and easiest and best things you could do to be successful and to bring honor and dignity and more liberation to your family. And then what did Uncle Sam have for us? A whole lot of zeros with negative in front, right?
Yeah.
And a whole lot of consequences if we can't meet those, on top of a lot of other things, And so, like, even today, we still see that. And so what Holtzclaw was doing, and doing this tightrope dance theologically, right? Like, because, like, these Black church folks are wanting to know, who do you serve? And what do you believe? And whose theology are you counting for? Because, again, back then, Black churches were not, and Black church denominations, they were not solely about what you believed as an individual. These were people who were working hard, organizing their communities in order to ensure that people who were recently freed from enslavement, people who were still surviving the violence of sharecropping and those economic systems, to ensure that people could eat, that people could survive, that they could have roofs over their heads. So this was serious business. And so for him to start this school, knowing that he wanted to keep central this school being able to have its own institutional integrity and autonomy, says so much. And it's a decision point, and it's a strategy and a vision that there's a lot of Black leaders today who do not have this level of resolve and backbone, to be able to say, I can look and dream 100 years into the future for Black folks. I'm not just thinking about the Black middle class through the next election. I am thinking about generation upon generation of young Black people who haven't even been born yet. I want to ensure that their shot at their own dignity and agency is theirs. And Du Bois, again, I hear you, that's cute and sweet, but perhaps that won't come through letting the white people give it to us. Perhaps it comes through being very skillful. And so Holtzclaw is absolutely, like, I mean, you inviting me to this conversation, this research, absolutely is telling me I have a lot more to learn about him and to really dig in and to deepen in. Even you reminding me that he was a printer, right? Like, that is, I was looking up today the definition of a polymath. You know, what does it mean to be what does it mean to be a Black polymath, y'all? You know,
Right.
George Washington Carver was listed on Wikipedia as a Black polymath. I sure hope I can come close to that when I grow up. If I play my cards right, I might be a little bit more like you, Miss Jean. But you know, Holtzclaw absolutely is somebody who we should be looking to from now and definitely in the moment that we are in with all of the political, economic, social challenges. As a person who has been, you know, right on the front lines of the Black Lives Matter movement and taken all of those hits, we need Holtzclaw. We need to learn from him. And I'm just grateful to you for telling us that and giving us the opportunity to come closer.
I appreciate you coming on my podcast today. I am so excited about our conversation that we've had. I want you to hold on a second after I end the recording, though. Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in for Sips from the Sip. Join me next time for a reading of Chapter 18 of William Holtzclaw's Black Man's Burden. This program is supported by donations from our listeners. If you enjoy learning about the history of William Holtzclaw, the Utica Institute, and Mississippi, consider donating. To support Sips from the Sip and all the work at the Utica Institute Museum, visit our Patreon at patreon.com/Utica Institute. Until next time, this has been Jean Greene coming to you from the heart of the Sip.